So this fourth Sunday of Easter is universally called the Good Shepherd Sunday because every year we have some section of the 10th chapter of John about the Good Shepherd. And it's also, by custom, the day of prayer for vocations. Vocation specifically to the shepherding ministry of the priesthood. So this year, since we're kind of lacking priests, there are just as many parishes as priests at this point in New York. Cardinal Dolan has asked us priests to tell our vocation story. So I'm going to burden you with that. If I get a little emotional, you'll understand why. Anyway, I was raised in a Catholic family on Long Island. I went to the parish grammar school, and in the 8th grade, when I was 13, I read a biography of the Curé of Ars, who, as you probably know, was the French priest, ordinary guy in France in the 19th century, known for confessing the confession especially, and he's the patron of parish priests, in fact, in the church. So as I was reading that is when I really first strongly felt the call. And it is a call. The gospel says, Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice." Well, yes. If we're listening, the shepherd will speak and call us to whatever we're called to be and to do. So during high school, I went to Regis High School, just a few blocks from here, and during that time, the Jesuits would ask, what do you plan to do with your life? And so I would write down, doctor or priest. So of course the Jesuits said, aha. So they made sure that they invited us who had responded that way, to retreats at the Jesuit house, a formation house in Shrub Oak. And indeed, I did feel called by the end of high school. I felt, first of all, I loved the Jesuits, curiosity and their energy. As a young man, that really drew me. And I also very consciously said to myself, even at 16 and 17, I said, I've been given so much. I do want to give back. And that should be our attitude, whatever we do in life or wherever we are in life, to be able to give. We've received freely, give freely, as Jesus said. So I did enter the Jesuits when I was 17. They don't do that anymore, but then I felt called, as you probably know, after finishing Fordham undergraduate with them, to the monastic life. And so at 22, I entered the Carthusians in Vermont, and that's where, 7 years later, just before my 30th birthday, that I was ordained. I very much identified with Thomas Merton, the famous Cistercian, who, in the weeks leading up to his ordination, he thought, I'm going to be struck by lightning, I'm sure. I can't possibly be called to this, but I was. So on June 13th, 1979, I was ordained in the parish church at the base of the mountain where my monastery was in Vermont. And my family was there. I'm the oldest of 8 siblings, so my whole family during the communion sang in 4-part harmony the Ave Verum Corpus of Mozart. Unfortunately, this was way before cell phones or even camcorders, so there's no record of it other than still pictures and in my own memory. But the priests who attended, a lot of my Jesuit classmates, a couple of whom had been ordained themselves just a few days earlier. My parish priest, when I was in the 8th grade, came. My Jesuit novice master was there, so it was a beautiful celebration. They all went for a big party on the mountaintop. There was an inn on the mountaintop, Mount Equinox, but I couldn't go because silence and solitude are what Carthusians are called to when we're not allowed to party. That really wasn't fair, but it's just as well because I felt so zapped. Then, I couldn't eat. I was so dazed. It was just as well. They make a big deal about the sacramental, character that you, theologically that you get in baptism and confirmation and in the holy orders. And sometimes that's way misused or misinterpreted, including by priests who say, "Wow, I've got a special mark. I can consecrate, the body and blood of Christ. I'm above the angels and all these poor other people down here, as if they're superhuman. If anything, becoming a priest means you're supposed to be more human, in the image of Jesus, who went around healing and helping and serving, not to be served, but to serve. And we need more of that anti-clerical attitude in our priesthood. But I really did feel it. There was some configuration to Christ the priest that I still feel today. So it's very real. The next morning I celebrated my first Mass with my family in the guest house, and the sermon I gave was on the blood of Christ. It was the Feast of Corpus Christi that year. And I said, go out and get drunk on the blood of Christ. So that was my first and last homily for 15 years, since we don't preach in the monastery, telling people to get inebriated with Christ's blood. And there's a prayer, St. Ignatius' prayer, Sanguis Christi inebriami, blood of Christ, inebriate me. And that's the way we should all live, whatever our vocation. Anyway, I was the first Carthusian ever ordained in the Western Hemisphere. So you had Catholic newspapers all over the country who had a picture of it. But I didn't stay there, as you probably know. I'm here. So after 15 more years, my first third of my priesthood was in the monastery. But in 1994, after 15 years of priesthood, I came to the archdiocese here in New York. And I wasn't sure whether this was going to work or not. Carthusians who are choir monks are automatically ordained. So sometimes if they leave the order, they leave the priesthood. Because the only reason they were ordained is because they were monks. So when they're not monks anymore, they're not priests anymore in practice. But that, of course, as I just said, is not my case. I was called to the priesthood way before I was called to the monastery. But I still wasn't sure it was actually going to work. So my first parish, St. Joseph's in Greenwich Village, it turned out it worked. Well, it seemed to, especially preaching, which I think is still something, I really try to do well. So I attended a retreat for priests a few years ago, and the presenter made some really interesting points. He said sometimes at the beginning of a person's priesthood, they're all about, the externals and about preaching the faith and the morals and the doctrine and, like young soldiers, which is okay as long as it's not immature. But that's just the first stage. He says later on, people tend to be more focused on the people, on the actual individuals to whom they're ministering. And then maybe towards the end, they focus on the spiritual life, both for them and for the people, to introduce them to deep union with God in prayer as well as the sacraments. Well, because of my background as a monk, I tend to put the emphasis on that last thing. How can I help people in their spiritual lives to be transformed in Christ? That's my concern as well. And I've always seen my priesthood, my ministerial priesthood, to be at the service of the baptismal priesthood. The baptismal priesthood that we all share is way more important than holy orders. We priests are just here, we ministerial priests are just here to be at the service of your growth and your needs, your spiritual needs, and sometimes physical needs with our pantry and everything. So, and my ministerial priesthood is at the service of my own baptismal priesthood to grow in the spiritual life as well. So, if you do feel called, celibacy can be scary, which for the moment at least is still a requirement. Don't forget, to give up founding your own family is a big deal. But if you're called, don't forget what Jesus himself promised to his disciples. Lord, what will we have if we follow you? And remember what he said. If you leave behind wife and children and mother and father and houses and lands for my sake, you'll receive 100-fold more in this life, as well as eternal life. In other words, you're our family. You know, all the people we serve in all our parishes with whom we often maintain lifelong relationships and deep relationships are our family. So if you do feel called, well, don't be afraid to answer it. Now the cardinal has, as you'll see in the back of church, issued these little cards called by name. You'll see them at the entrance. He invites people to nominate young men from their parish who they think might be interested, and send the card to the Archdiocese. Well, obviously you're not going to do that until and unless you check with the person you're going to nominate. Please. You're not going to get a cold call from this chancery. No. Make sure you check and see, do you mind if I submit your name? And by the way, if you're a young man, or maybe not necessarily young, who's able to do that, you want to nominate yourself, I don't see why you can't. But I just say this one last thing, and this applies to me too. I have never met, in my whole career as a priest, now 46 years, I've never met a fellow priest who even in private said to me, boy, I'm really unhappy as a priest. I wish I'd never become a priest. I have never heard that from anybody. And you may have even seen independent studies of vocational contentment and happiness. Priests are always at the top of the list, more so than lawyers or doctors or whatever it might be. So if you have the call and you do respond, well, statistically, you'll be happy. And the Lord guarantees that he'll be with you and transform you and all of that. So it's a wonderful call. And remember, all of us are called. All of us are priests, as I've just tried to emphasize. All of us are priests, prophets, and kings by our baptism. Some of us are called to serve that in others through ministerial priesthood. But all of us need to listen to the voice of the Good Shepherd who will lead us to the paths of happiness and joy and peace, whatever our vocation may be.